how can some of these systems be used to combat racism?
How do I amplify the more of rather than reduce the thing you want less of?
Do we have to always live in this chaos, or can we live in peace?
There's the bit about history matters always in conflict. What grabbed your attention yesterday needs to be amped up today to grab your attention. What type of country, what type of society, what type of culture do we want to have? And the more you can articulate that, the more you can start to generate new types of conversations. I think the relationship between parents and schools may be changing partly because of the way in which parents want to feel much more engaged in education.
Welcome to the final episode of this three-part series with Dr. Luke Roberts. In this episode, we'll talk about applying a systems thinking approach for societal changes, such as combating racism, promoting peace, fighting for human rights, and dealing with dictatorship regimes. Let's get into it.
So when we're thinking about systems and addressing broader changes, like societal changes, how can we apply that systems thinking to that?
I think with broader societal change, one of the things that's interesting in complex systems is amplification. So what is it that the system is amplifying? And so it's almost the opposite of like this echo chamber that's happening at the moment, which is like, how do we change the behaviors of people and then allow them to change the behaviors of others? And so amplification, like we saw it during the pandemic, when people started hoarding like toilet paper, like that wasn't done because, I was looking at someone say like hoard toilet paper. It was like I was looking at somebody else going, oh, they've got toilet paper, I need toilet paper. And then the person behind me probably thought like, if they've got toilet paper, I need to. And so you get these moments of amplification. So when we're thinking about broader social change, it can be for the positive or it can be for the negative with amplification. So how do we create amplification that benefits society? And I think that's the question. So then we started to think about, well, what's the energy that's needed for that amplification to happen? And then if it does happen, how does it come to some point of rest in the system that can then be maintained over time? So there's no point getting everyone excited if then like 2 days later, they've all forgotten about it. So it really is about creating these kind of social movements. And one of the people I've started to become most interested in is the work of Dr. Martin Luther King. Because when you start to really listen to his interviews and read him, he is a systems change expert. He just probably doesn't call it out that way, but he really is understanding like how you build momentum for a big systems change, a societal systems change.
And how can some of these systems be used to combat racism and promote diversity?
I always go with what's the positive. So like some people say like, we've got to end racism, but what is the positive thing you want? So do you want more inclusion? Do you want more peace in communities? Do you want more people to have identities where they feel they belong? So I think sometimes there's a danger that we define the problem and then we define the solution in the negative. So we want less of this. So we want less racism, but you're not telling me what you want more of. So how do I amplify the more of rather than reduce the thing you want less of? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And sense. So like, when I was working in prisons, they were always like, oh, Luke, we need to reduce violence. And I was like, by how much? 2%, 50%, 100%? And there was never a clear answer to that because they were caught on the reduction. And so they're in a deficit mode. So like, whereas actually we need to, and I did end up saying like, what I think you want is peaceful prisons, because peaceful prisons mean that people are thriving, they're learning, they're engaging in healthy, productive ways. And there's a stronger sense of social cohesion that allows people to do this. And they're like, whereas if we talk about just doing the absence of something, systems won't respond that way. So the question is always what you want. Are you framing it in the positive? And then how are you going to amplify it?
I was going to say, so does it help flipping it to make it positive, amplifying the positive change that you'd like to see? And then as a byproduct, that would reduce the negative.
Exactly. So it's like on a totally like individual basis. If I say like, right, I need to lose weight, how much weight do I need to lose? Whereas if I say like, I really want to get fit to be able to do some kind of sport, my goal and my success criteria for reaching that goal feels a lot more achievable because I know I'm moving towards something. So not only do I feel that I've got a sense of purpose and momentum, but I will get like feelings of satisfaction as I can achieve more of those things. Whereas if I'm in the deficit model, I don't get any sense of achievement as I'm reducing stuff, because it's like, to what end? What purpose does that achieve? So you're absolutely right. Always kind of like from a systems change perspective, what is the positive thing you want to achieve in the system? And then go towards that, amplify that.
Some of the systems I see in the world today kind of complement chaos in the world and like division in the world. Like it thrives off that, or it's set up like that. Even when you look at certain things happening in the world today, like the dehumanization of like people in the Middle East, for example, how can we like flip that script? Like, do we have to always live in this chaos, or can we live in peace?
So I'm an optimist, and I would say we can always strive for peace, and peace must have more opportunities than conflict and chaos. And what I mean by that is that, like, once we're into conflict, it becomes its own system, self-reinforcing. And so you start to limit more and more possibility and opportunity for alternatives. So dehumanizing is a great way to limit opportunities, because it says you can only fit in this box, you can only achieve these things. And so if we're going to break out of those, we need alternative systems, and we need to be able to move towards those alternative systems. Because the danger can sometimes be we put too much responsibility on, well, the individual to be able to achieve that difference. Whereas actually, what are the conditions that allow that person to thrive? And so when we're thinking about this dehumanization, stereotyping, these types of things, they reduce empathy, they reduce creativity, and therefore it becomes a lot easier to create harm.
It normalizes the conflict, right? So if there is conflict, if that's been programmed into your mind that, okay, well, this is normal in the Middle East, they're used to this happens all the time, maybe the value of a human life isn't worth as much there as here. And then when you see these events happening, it doesn't really impact you as much. I do think that's changing now, especially with social media. People are starting to see the reality of things and notice how some of these things are interconnected to other things. Because I always think when I see these situations, who is benefiting from this situation? And if you trace it back, then you start to realize why these things are happening in the first place and how it's been orchestrated in a way to benefit certain people or organizations.
I think there's a bit about history matters always in conflict. I think the danger of normalization is that it says there's no other option because this is just the way it is. And so it's the ability to resist that narrative that's crucial. I think the risk with social media is that when you're seeing traumatic, harmful things, over time you become normalized to that as well. So like what grabbed your attention yesterday needs to be amped up today to grab your attention, and then needs to be amped up even more tomorrow, because we're starting to become desensitized to the narrative of suffering, if that makes sense. And so once I become desensitized to the narrative of suffering, I can go, well, I can distance myself from it. And again, it goes back to, well, where are the voices that are being heard that are calling for change? And where are the voices that are being heard that said that there's a better alternative out there? So simply saying like, you know, we need to escalate the conflict in some way means that you're now back into that conflict loop between like those combatants who are saying, right, we need more weapons. Well, we need more technological weapons. Well, we need more technological. And you get caught in that because the lack of imagination in the situation means that we lose sight of, well, what does peace look like to us? And so this is why this idea around systems change becomes so important, because once you have those dominant or embedded interests, they're very hard to shift because they help perpetuate the pattern of behavior. So what's going to help shift that conflict may not even be the primary players in it, but what's all the auxiliary players they also need to be influenced to say, right, there could be a better way than what's happening right now.
Yeah. What can we do as individuals to move towards some changes, or when it comes to like certain governments in place? Obviously, thing close to my heart is Iran, and I would like to see change in that country. Does it always have to come within the country or the people, or are there things that we can do as individuals to help these countries overcome some of the struggles that they're facing?
So I would say on that one, what is an alternative future? And how can you help articulate and visualize that? So it's one thing calling for change. Like in conflict situations, you can oppose the other. So in Iran, you could oppose the regime, for example. But what comes after that? Like, what does that future look like? Yeah. And the more you can articulate that, the more credible the system change becomes. Otherwise, what you end up with, and we've seen it in the past as well, is you remove a dictator and you just get a vacuum of power. And it's filled by other people who are conditioned to be in conflict or to seek power, as opposed to, well, what does the vision look like after this? Are we going to be, what type of country, what type of society, what type of culture do we want to have? And the more you can articulate that, the more you can start to generate new types of conversations. And I think that's where the creativity comes in. So you might have an idea like, okay, well, what could we look like as the most, innovative AI country in the world? And then somebody else might go, well, and then what would we look like if we're the most sustainable environmental AI country? You can see the creativity is being built on. Otherwise, you get drawn back into, here's my opposition to X, but I don't know what happens when X goes.
Yeah, I think that's part of the issue with Iran specifically, is like, we all know that we want change and what the future could look like in terms of, more rights for women and like tourism and people traveling to Iran. But I think no one really thinks about what's next and what would the next government even look like. Like, there's no leadership there. They just know that we want something better, but no one really knows what it is.
And that's
because if it falls apart, it's like, I think there'll be chaos again, because even within the communities, there's loads of division. So I know people want change, but you can imagine if it does fall, that people will seek power again, and it could become worse. You don't know, but no one has that mapped out.
And I don't think it has to be mapped out in like a precise way, but it has to be mapped out in a way that can be articulated. So what, like Martin Luther King he set out a vision of the future post segregation in America. So it's like, okay, if we change, this is what's going to happen. It didn't happen in the way he probably anticipated or would have wanted, but he set out enough of a vision for people to go, right, that's why we protest. That's why we campaign, because it's not just about the change of the law, but it's the change of the institutions that come with that as well. And so it feels more real and relevant rather than like, we want change, but change is a very abstract notion. And so I think, again, in terms of what can people do from the outside looking into a system, the ability to articulate, well, here's a world of possibility. So what do we know? Like, we know that there's going to be issues around climate change. We know we've got a really young, creative population. We know like a country like Iran has an incredibly rich history. How do those three things come together in the future? Then you're starting to map out an alternative vision, an alternative route to a different type of systems change.
Yeah. Then I want to move on to exploring the family unit. And some may say it's now like a broken family unit in the world we live in today. And I want to know what you think the impact on education is with the family unit we have today, because you have, both men and women with a family unit working long hours, stressful jobs, maybe not spending as much time with the kids, and the kids are spending most of the time in school. So, you may not have as much control in terms of what they're teaching your kids. Because I've heard stories of schools teaching a lot of weird things that I didn't get taught in school, or pushing certain ideologies onto your kids and making them think in a certain way. And I think it's really the education your parents give you that make you the best human beings, and not necessarily the education from the school system. Because I think, based on what we've already discussed, is that could lead to like these broken societies where it is causing more division, chaos, conflict. And that's part of the system that they use to fuel that engine. In terms of some of the issues we've already talked about, is that you don't want people to get along, you want division, and that could start from the schools. Because I think that's where you'd start, is you'd start with the kids, right? So push the ideology onto them, cause conflict, and then that funnels its way into society, or you build the next generation of people that may not be aligned with each other. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it depends what we mean by family, first of all. So, like, go back 150 years, everyone was in the workhouse. You know, children as well. Like, we had to have laws to say children should go to school rather than lose limbs in factories, kind of thing. So I think it always depends on what time and what context. And also, like, are we saying like families are broken down because they don't apply the 2.5 children model that came like post World War as well? So this is where like definition of family is, you know, it's rooted in history and how has it changed over time. So things that feel like they're breaking down to us is because we might have very fixed positions on what we think family should be, not that they ever were, kind of thing. So I think there's that aspect. And I think in terms of the way in which schools interrelate with parents, I think because schools have become so focused on, you know, in the UK, for example, it's very much about kind of like, you know, what's their Ofsted rating or what's their exam results. In the States, for example, it's much more, there's like a lot more parent choice, for example, and that creates a lot more churn in the way in which children could just move around the education system. So then it's much more like, how do we hold on to these children to show that we are adding value to their lives to parents? So I think the relationship between parents and schools may be changing partly because of the way in which parents want to feel much more engaged in education, as opposed to, my child will learn the curriculum and go get a job. Like, I actually want to know what my child is learning now. And I think, again, that requires feedback, that requires boundary crossing as well, in terms of what's the relationship between the parent and the teacher and how does that influence the child. And I think for me, there's something in there which is around, like, you will always get multiple perspectives and there will always be conflicts and contradictions between the way parents are and the way schools are. But that's okay if it's done through dialogue and discussion, where I think it starts to become like my way or the school's way as absolutes. That's always a concern to me, because then you're just setting yourselves up for conflict.
Yeah. Because you see a lot of parents now homeschooling their kids because maybe they want more insight into what they're being taught. So I mean, personally, like, if I had a kid, I wouldn't want him to go into school and getting told that it's okay to cut your genitals off, for example.
That would be quite extreme, I've got to say.
No, but I've heard stories that's happening it is being normalized in the US, that at a young age they get taught about these certain topics.
What is it? I think there's again, it goes back to, there's a big societal shift, which is, rather than I go to work, I have kids get schooled, there's what's the relationship I want with my child. And partly because we're growing older, we're spending longer time with our children, but also because the investment is so high in your child or in your children in terms of the relationships you're cultivating, the people you want them to be in the future. So I think this is where again, it's like, how do schools adapt to the needs of parents? And the curriculum might have been something that most parents never would have thought about 40, 50 years ago. Like, you're just going to do whatever the school teaches you and you'll respect the teacher. And as time has changed, people want to see what's going on. They want a different type of relationship, which means that parents do want to have stronger access to the curriculum. They may want to have their voices heard in that curriculum choice as well. And when you've got systems that can be very rigid or take a long time to change in response to that, what's the quickest way to get what I want? Opt out of that system. The question then becomes, what are the benefits of opting out as opposed to being within that? And for children who are homeschooled, where's this, the parent might have either a lot of control or absolute control over what they're learning. But then does the child know how to negotiate, create social interactions? Because you're missing out on the peer dynamic. And some parents may be able to fulfill that. So there's pros and cons with these kind of shifts. And the question goes back to, well, again, what's the interaction? How is that interaction happening? How could it be in the future?
Do you think the optimal solution would be to have this kind of co-creation of the curriculum between the parents and the school?
No,
system?
I don't, because I think it needs to be wider. That's too binary for me. It would also be, what are the needs in the local community as well? So what the local employers want, and then again, who else needs to be involved in that? So for example, I remember talking to a futurologist years ago, and she was like, I'm looking at the workplace of the future, Luke. And she said, like, the two biggest skills you're going to need are empathy and creativity to survive in the workforce of the future. I was like, wow, like, what an insight. Like, really glad I had that conversation with her. So then the question becomes, like, how does that knowledge get threaded into that co-creation where there are people who are looking much longer term with a much more precise view on a particular aspect than nobody else in that community might have looked at, and weave that together, and you get a really exciting educational dynamic.
So we talked about some of these social issues. Where does social energy come into play? Because you mentioned it in your book that social energy is attention, information, and money.
Yeah. So I was asked to explain in my PhD why inaction is a form of action in systems. And it took me ages to think this one through. Like, I was really struggling. And it all started because two of the schools I was working with at the time didn't respond to my emails. And I was like really freaking out as a researcher. I was like, I need you to engage. And my supervisor was like, no, if you're interested in systems, explain why you're not getting a response. And so I was kind of like, I was doing lots of reading, and I kept on thinking, it's not about resources. It's about energy and how energy moves in systems. So like, if you think of like an electrical system, it's really easy to spot where energy is because it's the current moving around. Whereas if you think about something like energy in the sea, like, actually energy is in the wave. The wave is energy moving in given form. But when that energy disperses, like, it becomes like water, it becomes sound. And I was thinking, right, so what's the equivalent in a social organization? Like, human beings are social creatures. And so for a kind of like, when I say social, I mean human social here. I was thinking, right, how do I explain energy in human organizations? And so I kind of took the idea of attention. So where does attention go in organizations? And if it doesn't, are we blind to it? Hence the point about organizational blindness. Then I started to think about, okay, so if you've got attention, then we've also got money. So like, what does money buy? Does money buy information, or does money buy attention? Because the two things can be very different. Like, I can buy your attention, but it doesn't mean I've told you anything. So like, could you see how it starts to weave itself together? And I was like, and I remember like, I'd be like going around organizations, like looking at, like their posters on the wall, and like, okay, so you've paid for like that internal comms. Who's reading it? Who's actually looking at it? And what does it mean to them? And so, that's how energy started to kind of come into my mind as this way of understanding not just what's the dynamics in the system, because I keep on talking about the interconnection. So energy is the interconnection between things here. And also, like, how does it get used? Where does energy get stored in an organization? Where does it get dispersed in an organization? And then, what happens when something isn't given energy, often it means that thing's going to die. So if we go back to our point earlier about projects, interventions and programs, well, they're given a huge amount of energy sometimes to get them up and running, but the organization over time just starts to turn off the energy tap. Not enough information, not enough attention, not enough money, and it will just trickle out and die. So it became a really useful way to explain the sustainability of change within social systems.
So is it like a triangle that needs to be balanced, or
No,
how
I
would
can't
you-
stand triangles. I'm all about circles.
Okay.
So I think it's about just recognizing it's about flows. And like, yeah, I can see that because it's three things, you could put it in a triangle. But what happens when you've got money and information, but you don't have attention? And some things like, social causes require information and attention before you need money. So this is why they weave together, but also if you pull one out, what does that tell you about the energy in the system?
There's a bit more fluid.
Yeah.
Because I was imagining a triangle where, if you trade off one, it impacts the other sort of thing.
Yeah. It is more fluid than that. It's like you might start off with one, like I really know something, but how do I get people to pay attention to it? Okay, do I pay for it or do I find ways to grab attention? Do I do something shocking, for example? But then, like, if I do something shocking, does someone want to sponsor me to do that again? And you can see, but sometimes all you might need is to just grab people's attention. Other times, just having a big pile of money doesn't create energy in the system.
Yeah. We talked about sustainability earlier. Why is sustainability so important?
I think sustainability, in the way I'm thinking about it, is keeping the best of what we've got and adapting to enable that to thrive in the future. And in a world where it feels like there's lots of short-term, quick win, low-hanging fruit language, you lose this idea of sustainability. Leaders lose this idea of sustainability. And so what you end up with is short-term memory of things that have happened. So, and the danger is you then reinvent the wheel like every 18 months kind of thing. So sustainability is a way of breaking us out of that mindset and saying, if we really value the change we want to make in the world, it's not enough to make the change. You have to be able to sustain it so that others can then start to walk that path behind you. And that for me is really crucial because it's about the longevity combined with the action and the intention to see things happen beyond me as well. So kind of going back to the point, like, why do this in education? Because some children will benefit from a particular type of intervention one year, but it gets changed another. And, those children lose out on what was a good thing because we've now moved on. We haven't sustained the good that was there. And likewise in organizations, if you have a really good program that, your team is really thriving in, why would you change that rather than try and build on it and make it something that could be organizational wide, rather than going, you know what we're going to do this time? We're going to try this thing instead, or we're going to move to this type of intervention or initiative. And so this idea of sustainability is so powerful to systems because it's the way of saying that you recognize interdependence and interconnection over time.
So we don't change what's working and just keep continuously improving what is working rather than starting from scratch every time you don't see results immediately.
I think it's recognizing the past. You may have to make a radical change. So sometimes you can continuously improve. Totally get that. At other points, you've reached a threshold at which the system can no longer achieve the things you want. So continuously improving is just maintaining the status quo because it needs a radical change now. And then the question is, how is that radical change going to be sustained? Because just doing it can create a whole heap of chaos unless we kind of go, right, we recognize that there will be a bit where there's messiness, uncertainty, but over time, we will continue to put energy into the system to achieve the benefits, the long-term goals that we think would benefit not just us, but our communities, our organizations, our colleagues. And in doing that, it means we have to stay focused longer on the things that really matter to us.
Yeah. And I like to end the podcast with one question. how can we better serve ourselves and serve others? What can we start doing from today to better serve ourselves and others?
I think it's, from my perspective, it's slow down, look for interconnection, listen, and try and have a lot more empathy.
And how can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about some of the things you do?
So my book is out now. So we mentioned that at the beginning. So that's out by Routledge, and hopefully it's well worth a read, kind of thing. And yeah, I do have a website as well, so they can more than happy to reach out on that as well.
Thanks a lot, Luke. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sina.
Thank you.
We have come to the end of this 3-part series. I hope you enjoyed these episodes and that it has given you some things to reflect on. I think if we want to see a change, we need to collectively be that force and see things from a different perspective rather than being narrow-minded and just accepting things the way they are. Thanks for watching, and if you found this valuable, please subscribe to the channel, and I look forward to seeing you back soon.